Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dwight again. Welcome back to Girded with Truth. I hope you guys have enjoyed yesterday's session as we're continuing on the topic of called in conflict. Today, we'll be jumping in a little bit in terms of what that conflict actually is, or the time itself, or the period of conflict. We're going again. Yesterday, we looked at 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1, and we looked at when God is calling people, the first thing that, or one of the indications basically that our seasons after shifting is a shift in the way in which God communicates with us. So it means to see that He doesn't want us to become dependent on one methodology or one way in which He speaks, but being open towards us actually listening to Him in multiple different ways. Right, today we're jumping into 1 Samuel chapter 3 verses 2, where it says, "And it came to pass in that time, Eli was laid down in his place, and his eyes began to wax dim, and he could not see." What is interesting to note there is that we can actually say, well, his eyes was dim because he was growing old. But there is something there that we probably need to look at a little bit differently, because of the fact that the first verse told us that the word of the Lord was scarce in those days because there was no open vision. Could it mean that Eli's eyes were dim spiritually speaking, that he could not be able to see what God was, trying to communicate with him in those seasons? I would think so, and one of the reasons I'm saying that too is because the shift basically was in towards God's word as opposed to the open vision, because that's what people were reliant on. And the priestly office itself had become corrupt, so much so to the point where God needed to shift things. And you can even look at 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 12 to around 21 there, where it gives us an introduction to Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, where it says, verse 12 says, "The sons of Eli were sons of Beli. They knew not the Lord." It goes down to 21 there, where it kind of explains everything that they were doing. It was really bad to the point where they were sleeping with people in the temple, and they were even taking the sacrifices for themselves, as opposed to be the men who were supposed to sacrifice to God. They were keeping the meats for themselves. But the interesting point to note there is that it wasn't just Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, but it was a season or a period where people did not know the Lord. In fact, Judges chapter 21, verse 25 tells us that in those days, there was no king in Israel, and every man did which was right in his own eyes. Now that's a really hard or bad place to be, because that's the conflicting part. It was so much so, it was the conflict within Israel. The called people of God was so bad to the point where there was an account where an interesting point happened where they began to fight among themselves. There was civil war where the tribe of Benjamin rose up to actually defend against something that was happening, and it was against another tribe of Israel. So the conflict then was internal with God's people, to the point where they began to fight each other. But even more interesting point to note there is that it didn't start there. It started in Judges chapter 2 verses 10, where it says, "And also that generation were gathered unto their fathers," which means it's Joshua and that generation had died and moved on. "And there arose another generation after them which knew not the Lord, nor yet the works which he had done for Israel." So it's showing us there that the conflict itself stems or begins in a point or a place where the generation did not know the Lord. And one of the things for us to note there is that knowing the Lord is not only in one particular form or fashion, hence the reason why we were seeing the things that God had done for Israel. Moses is a pretty good example, where in one season he smote a rock, next minute he had to speak to a rock. So it was showing there that God wasn't set in one specific way of doing things. So they got water out of a rock 2 separate times. The first one he had to smite the rock, the second time God asked him to speak to the rock, because God wanted him to shift with him and not be set in a specific way, to know, okay, this is the way in which it was done before, let me do this again, and the same thing will happen. Yes, God is the God of today, yesterday, today, and forever. That's who he is, but that's not how he works all the time. That's why he changes his ways all the time. So the conflict that we're seeing here is arisen or comes out of the place where people did not know the Lord. And the conflict there now becomes Men are deciding in their own mind or in their own right what is right and wrong in their own eyes. So they begin to decide and say, okay, I believe this is right, so I will do this. I don't think that is right, so therefore I will not do that. They were their own judges, they were their own rulers. They removed God Himself from the headship to position themselves at that headship. And that is the point where, we need ourselves to look at to say, well, who is in charge? Who is our headship? Where is He? If it's ourselves, then we probably need to do some rain check in terms of who we are and in terms of how we live our Christian life. Because we really should be putting God at the forefront there, or God at the top. So, to conclude today's session, Eli's eyes grew dim. So it showed there that there is a change, or his inability to then discern the voice of God. And we'll even see that moving forward, where the open vision was the focus to the point where the air itself was unable to discern the voice of God, as we can see lower down. So I urge each and every one of you today, as I conclude, in times of conflict, shift the way in which you communicate with God, but you have to perceive the shift itself that He is doing. The way in which He's communicating with you, shift it. And the second thing is, identify exactly who is the one in charge at that particular point there. Is either God or yourself. Alright? I hope this was okay, is informative to you guys, and made you think a little bit, because it really did make me think. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you will like and subscribe and all that good stuff with it. Have a good one, everyone.